As I said earlier, forecast, predictions is very complex. Thank you very much to warmly welcome Jean-Christophe Caffet, the economist chief of Coface.
Bonjour Jean-Christophe.
Good morning, Jean-Christophe. So, we'll look at your forecast in just a moment, but beforehand, the Coface barometer 2025. You have 100 or so slides, I think, to help us look in the finer detail. Is that right? That's right. Yeah, good morning. Thanks very much for your warm welcome, Stéphane. So rest assured, it's all going to go well in terms of the graphs. I haven't got too many. For the rest, we'll wait and see. But yes, this year we're innovating. I wanted to show you the results of our latest barometer. It came out yesterday. It's available as custom dictates on our website. It's a barometer, let me point out. It's a collector's item because it's the last edition in this format. It will switch in June to be a more distilled format. I say no more. Let's leap into the deep end because I've got a lot of ground to cover. All right then, so what do we see here? This map won't change. These are our country risk appraisals. You're familiar with this. The major message, if you will, is that the world is risky. I think Femke, Andrew and Thomas, I think they laid that out quite clearly. That's not going to change in the short term. So one or two changes, however, this quarter. Some countries that are doing better. Guyana, for example, producing oil, has been upped to B this term. Luxembourg as well, which is joining the A1 club, select few, with Switzerland, Norway and Denmark. And then I think we ought to mention the UK, without wishing to play down the change. But this quarter, there has been a reclassification. It wasn't straightforward for the UK, it must be admitted, thinking about the backdrop that has just been reminded of us, the financial markets upheavals. If you remember in January, you remember what happened in the bond markets, particularly with British debt, such as it is. But when you look at how things stand with the UK, we must confess, really, it is improving from a microeconomic perspective because defaults last year were down 5% compared with 2023. In terms of macro, things are changing as well. There is a silver lining, internal demand, not only with consumer spending linked in with inflation dotted around everywhere, but also corporate investments. Volumes are up from one quarter rather to the next, which contrasts quite considerably in terms of what we see corporation investment-wise in Europe. And then politically, Keir Starmer, the new UK PM, has a stable electoral constituency with, 80-seat majority in the Commons, which contrasts heavily with what we see in most European countries, and France would be a case in point. So I'm not going to dwell on Botswana, Bangladesh and Maldives, who've been taken down some notches. You'll see the reasons for that in our barometer, and I've got enough bad news to get across to not dwell on that, which brings me neatly to our sectorial classifications. So more downer notches than up notches, 8 up notches. Most of the downward swing is in European automotive, right across Europe really, east, west and central, for a number of reasons. No doubt you have them top of mind. Cyclical, short term, but also unfortunately long term. European automotive is moving down a gear in terms of its down in terms of its capacity by 10%. Automotive inventory as well doesn't help us. Well, it doesn't seem to suggest that will be a turnaround or a rally, if you like, in the short term. Anyway, moving to the next slide, what do we see? Well, we see one concerning trends in terms of buying New cars, 20% down as opposed to the beginning of 2019. 15% for manufacturing, 20% for buying new cars. So, and to be totally exhaustive, I think you'd also have to add on the shrinkage of European automotive market share in selling and manufacturing. Looking at Asia, Japanese, Korean, but more recently, as you'd expect, Chinese, they're muscling in. So you can see on my left-hand pie chart, this is what's feeding into our pessimism in the long term for European automotive. You can see it laid out here. Very briefly, China is dominating. That's an understatement. 81% of the battery market, well, you can see the figure here, 81% of lithium battery capacity, and 95%, my senior Lucu, my analyst, will set me right, I've got this wrong, but phosphate-based lithium batteries possibly turn out a lesser good performance than other battery types in terms of autonomy and recyclability and life expectancy. But their advantage, of course, is they're less expensive, which offers a competitive advantage, which is by no means negligible advantage for the Chinese manufacturers. So Simon brought out an article beginning of October last, if memory serves, talking about this very point. And the next article, which will offer a summary, Elisabeth Rosenberg will be offering the research framework for Simon's article, and this should come out between now and the end of the month. So that's just a bit of advertising. Before moving on, let's look at the underlying macroeconomic outlooks that is underpinning, if you will, our entire analysis for 2025. Of course, marked uncertainty, broad uncertainty. I looked at the news before I came up on stage to see if anything had happened in the meantime, but world growth is stabilizing, 2.7%, as we should have seen in 2024. 2.7, that's a half percentage point, as opposed to the world growth. It's quite muted growth over the long term at least, but this growth will be driven mainly by emerging countries that will be feeding into 2/3 of that total growth, despite a Chinese slowdown once again. And advanced economies driven by the United States, as always, overperforming, 2.2% there. They're slowing down, but it's very difficult to see the wheat from the chaff based on the announcements made by Trump. And they come and go, don't they, these announcements? Anyway, for Europe, and this is the bad news, is stagnating. Its growth is around 1%, possibly less, particularly when you look at the PCI risk weighing down on European business. Now, what about defaults? Well, defaults in this underlying are continuing with their trend. They're up considerably, and in most developed countries and emerging countries. It may stabilize in the second half, possibly towards the end of the year in Europe, thanks to the loosening of ECB monetary policy, which should, well, as you know, corporate indebtedness is huge in Europe. And of course, credit costs respond quite quickly to the monetary policy espoused by the central bank. So I don't have 100 slides, as Stefan said, but I'm only one or two, as you would have seen, and there'll be two roundtables, one on advanced economies and one on emerging economies. Well, they're either side of the lunch break. Of course, with the current context, everything is up in air, really, and fragile. And this is really why I prefer let my colleagues talk about their own forecast. Thanks very much. But you're staying with us, Jean-Christophe, aren't you? So take a seat. So we're going to be talking about the outlook, what 2025 holds, and we're interested in your view, obviously. But before we talk about 2025, let's look at 2024. So with hindsight, how do you see 2024? Were you struck possibly by one or two things or not? Well, from a macroeconomic perspective, I would say not really. World growth, as we saw, should be around 2.7% at current exchange rates. It's down half a percentage point as opposed to last year. That discrepancy stems from the US performance that surprised things because it was up. It was double, actually, what we initially forecast for the US. But for the rest, went as we saw, not entirely so necessarily for Europe, it must be said. For the situation in Europe, it's tricky, particularly for Germany, which booked a second consecutive year of a stagnating GDP. But mainly, the key take-homes which were what we announced last year in this very room: commodities, raw materials, energy prices, well, pretty muted, even though basically volatile. But we have inflation that continued, even though it was rather laborious, with this problem of services inflation remaining high in the last mile paradigm. Central banks dropped their rates, not according to market expectations, because the Fed and the ECB dropped 100 basis points, whereas what was expected was 150. What about long rates? They remained high or increased considerably in some countries. Now, we warned about interest rates, short-term and long-term, and we stay on high long-term rates. That's our stance. And then defaults, they were on the up, and they continue to do so, particularly in Europe, quite considerably so, where deflation eroded significantly operational margins among corporates. Surprises last year, then? Well, I suppose it's more in the political arena. Even though Xavier went over the results of the elections, pretty much constant with what we expected, we were surprised by their scale. Look at the United States. It was a bit of a sea change with Trump. Contrary to what we expected. In Modi, in India, spring last, we were surprised as well. Of course, you'd have to mention France, which continues to be very striking. That's right. We were surprised by dissolving Parliament, and that hasn't really demuddied the waters. But anyway, for 2024, across the board, now, where are the risks, would you say, and what risk profiles are we looking at? Well, I think the main risk, really, for our central scenario, 2025, is foreign policy and economic policy, because they're intimately linked now with the American administration. Of course, you've got Trump's manifesto. I don't want to revisit that in any detail. But the two fears that we could have, I think, are materializing. In other words, his program, no doubt, will be rolled out, and rather quickly, or rather abruptly. We've seen the initial announcements, even though, of course, he's backtracked on migration, deregulation, and tariffs. But in some areas, he has done what he said he'll do. So some of these measures are good for American growth, deregulation, fall in tax levels. That's, in theory, positive for American business. Others are deleterious. The slashing in public spending that Musk wants to do as early as this year, closing the borders as well for men, women, and merchandise is bad for American business. But it's difficult to really know. It's difficult to know what the American economy will do and where it's going. There is a consensus, however. I suppose where we can be reasonably confident about is inflation. Inflation should be driven up by these measures. In terms of business and trade in America, here's a figure. Looks a bit impossible. Well, anyway, for the rest of the world, less doubts. Impact will be negative. Obviously, we have China and we have allies, US trade partners. We've got a round table that will adjust itself to that point. And then, of course, with Europe, we're very much in the firing line for Trump. So you don't see a short-term improvement, this year at least, for Europe, because there's a consensus among economists. They see a significant uptick in growth. You don't believe in that? Well, no, I don't really sign up to that. When you look at the macro scenarios for the Eurozone and continental Europe, when you look at that, you realize that this acceleration, which is buoyed up which is defended, if you will, by the OECD and the ECB, thinks that there'll be an upturn of corporate investment and disbursement of people's savings. Look at the margins. Look at the order books of corporations, orders in Europe. And look at the intensity of foreign competition on export markets. Look at China. Look at the rise in tariffs, border tariffs. It's difficult to see how things would ever pick up in Europe. Look at households. I find it difficult to believe that people will be spending their savings when labour market is dipping. Factories are closing, and they have done since last year. People worried about jobs. Look at surveys, polls done by Europe. We're at record levels of savings among households within Europe. Yes, but earlier on you're talking about the central banks. The ECB should be continuing its cycle of falling interest rates. That should help. Yeah, but that's not enough. Far from it. But yes, but it's true. I mean, it will help. The ECB will be dropping its rates, and that will help. Yes, because that will prompt households to save. Because we have bonds, for example, backed onto those savings. We also have corporations or households that want to invest, and they want to get the best interest rate. So if that's true, but it really depends on how big the interest rates falls, and it depends on the scale of your investment. Maybe for mortgages, I don't know, but that's not necessarily enough to bite to produce an uptick. Anyway, we have savings on the one hand and productive investment on corporations. I don't think it's plausible. So for increasing European growth, you have to wait for 2026? We'll have to let 2025 go by, or 2028? No, keep on going, I would say. I mean, to be, cards on the table, I don't see any rally in Europe. And if Europe doesn't really turn things around quickly, there will be no rally. And you realize that quickly. And what I mean by that is you need to really challenge economic policies that have been espoused thus far, particularly dogmas. The total dogma of free and unskewed competition, which is designed to favour the consumer rather than the manufacturer. But of course, initially, the entire apparatus was built around manufacturing. Look at the 1954 steel and coal organization. But I mean, I heard you say something interesting. Just butt in. There was an interview on a competing radio station, competing to mine. There's no instantaneous winning. There's no magic wand with the economy. That's right. There's no magic wand which suggests that when you fall, you come back up again. I mean, there is no spontaneous healing cure unless you're in I don't know, maybe you have a temporary exogenic effect, maybe an adverse winds, adverse climates, etc. But we're not there. Europe, if you look at what's going on in Europe, the big numbers, Europe is deindustrializing, it's aging, it's deindustrializing very, very quickly, becoming extremely reliant, if not to say vulnerable, for its energy supplies and for a whole other pain points. It's lagging behind in terms of technological innovation, particularly in digital. And we have some corporations from outside that are cheating. We have stagnating growth for at least 10 years. And we think about its security. And there has been an economic lack of solidarity within Europe as well. Now, we have Draghi's report. And yes, you're not very positive then, not very optimistic as last year. Well, that's right, I suppose, yes. But look, the situation hasn't improved, since last year in no arena. And politically, things have gone south. Look at the elections in Europe and the European elections. Femke talked about this, and I would subscribe 100% to what she said. Just bear in mind, that today we've got 25% of European Parliament seats, 187 MPs, if you like, that are occupied by populist right or extreme right parties. Femke said far right, I think. Anyway, these parties hold power in 3 countries, Italy, the Czech Republic, and Hungary, right? And so we have those 3 countries, and then we have the Netherlands, Croatia, Finland, and Slovakia, where we have an element of far right in there in the government. Sweden as well. So what I'm driving at really is that these parties are not necessarily very interested in the European project, and I'm frightened that we're not moving towards greater integration. Whereas, I suppose that's our major. I mean, the world is becoming hostile, so we need to. What do you mean by integration? More and more integration? Well, what I mean by that is we need to combat the fact that Europe is coming away at the seams. And looking at the context that we're today, things may fragment further. Financial fragmentation. Look at the financial crisis, 2008, but we're still seeing discrepancies in interest rates within the Eurozone. And we have other matters which explain why that German corporates are sourcing 70% of their energy, 70% of their energy, which is more expensive than Spanish energy sources. And we have regulatory fragmentation over and beyond the way to officialdom that Draghi didn't like. Tax discrepancies. Remember 1995 in Chirac, what he said? Political fragmentation, which flows from all that. Of course, the list goes on. But I think what's of importance today, and what we need to be mindful of, is that there's a sense of emergency here. Europeans need to remember that we're decoupling on one side and fragmenting on another. Now, economists have been going on about this for 20 years. And this requires that we need to complete the single market, reinforce our resources, and pool resources. And that's very important. Reinforcing one hand and sharing of resources, that needs to go as a tandem. And to remain optimistic, because I think we need to be optimistic, I am, despite what you may think, the Europe has 2 GDP points of surplus year on year in Europe. It means that Europe is a machine to produce savings, 400 billion euros. That's what it equates to. That's half of what Mario Draghi wants us to invest. But if we did half, that would still be good. Now, you mentioned the Draghi report. It's offered huge inspiration to decisions that have been taken. But last year, ECB brought out its competitiveness compass. It says that competitively Europe needs to change. So isn't that the sign that with this compass, things are changing? Well, yeah, possibly. But if you think silver lining-wise, I mean, I don't want to challenge the fact that people are being mindful now, are waking up in Europe, and there's a change in doxa, particularly the European Commission with what it says. I don't disagree. But before waving lots of flags about this compass, let's make sure that it doesn't lead to the unraveling of achievements within Europe over the last few years, particularly from an environmental perspective, because the problem is a bit more deep-seated, I would say, than that. Fragmentation, uncoupling of Europe that we just referred to, these are serious problems, and they're not linked to the CSRD that turned up in 2024, if memory serves. Now, German elections in 3 weeks' time. We talked about that a moment ago in the first roundtable. In your view, is this an opportunity to pick up speed? Will it offer a European sea change in its policy? Well, I hope so, for Germany and for Europe. But as Femke said a moment ago, we don't know about anything, really. We have to wait and see what happens. The outcome of the elections, even though everybody thinks it will be the CDU in a coalition. We don't know with whom, by the way, SPD or the Greens on the face of it. But anyway, the government will have to set up, initiatives will have to be taken, but it will take time. And no doubt we won't know much, you or I, before the end of the year. in answer to the question. Now, last year, in this very room, you talked about Germany's problems. If we compare now with the situation in France, what do you think? Do you think that France is the ill man in Europe or the illest man in Europe?
Yes, France is the sick man of Europe. But it is being cured and it is getting better, it is receiving care, and then perhaps it'll come up with some other sickness. Given the state of present politics and governability, which was still ensured by the Fifth Republic, is now disappearing. Now, the problem with France, I've written a lot about it, and I have a lot of points of view on it. There was, in fact, a whole conference that I held on it. The main concern for France today, and I know this is not just limited to the French borders, it is a lack of productivity gains. Since demography, let's say, is not doing so great, and France is not an exception to the rule, so we think there's going to be very slow growth, probably around 1%. Now, concerning France, you were talking about productivity issues. What are the reasons for this weakness in productivity in France? I know there are several. Well, we could be here for 3 hours. Yes, I know. But anyway, the reasons are exactly the same. Education, investment in R&D, investment in industry, which is normally all in the manufacturing sector. In France, however, there are two factors, and that is our employment policy, which was now been led for the last 30 years, and essentially, or perhaps only, by exemption of social contributions. So let me give you some background. This was in the early 1990s. It was the Balladur government was fighting against unemployment, and which was really at 10% at the time. And since underqualified jobs tend to be more, let's say, nimble than qualified ones, so the exemption of these contributions was really for the lower earners. But the thing is, one never changed all this, and one didn't stop the exemption, and that became a kind of wartime medicine, if you like. It was like an emergency measure that was taken. So it became into a regular endemic disorder, if you like. We didn't really do anything about improving the educational system. We did nothing about improving the qualifications that were required. And as a result, it's not surprising that over time, employment is changing and it is yielding to lesser qualified jobs, because these lesser qualified jobs were supposedly subsidized by the more qualified jobs. And as a result, there's a deficit in productivity. Okay, so that's employment policy. And secondly, it's the quality of education that I mentioned in passing. If you look at France in all the scores, France is, just falling. In the latest PISA polling, for the 15 to 18 years, we are on the 30th rank in terms of the discipline concerned, and they cover about 80 or 83 countries. So this is a major drop, 15 or 20 ranks down compared to the early 2000s. If you look at just maths and science, if you look at the TIMSS poll, and that is really all about the more scientific subjects, again you see the same drop. And now France is in the second last position in European countries. Not very brilliant, is it? I know there are questions that are asked all the time. Maybe you shouldn't interpret all these tests, separately. But when you see all of them saying the same thing, obviously there's a problem. So what I'm trying to say is there's a sort of vicious circle in France to explain the present situation. And this was started off by the subsidies given to underqualified jobs. And as a result, it led to a deterioration in the educational system, and which in turn led to a lack of skilled labor. So low income, etc., and that gives rise to discontent. It is the perfect recipe for discontent, so a vicious circle, and perhaps one needs to reinvest in education, which in France would be to fight against this inequality that you have in schools, and also an improvement in teaching means and more means. Now, does France really have the means of investing in its educational system? Because, people say to us very often, I don't know if it's true or not, that it is one of the countries that spends most of the money in the European Union on education. Well, hang on, there's not much leeway when it comes to education. But if you need to make a choice, you really don't have a choice. It's really the mother of all battles. So you must take a long-term debt, or you train all the citizens, and which is not such a bad deal. Now, these are wrong ideas, accepted ideas, that we don't spend more than our neighbors on education. That's not true. If you look at the total internal expenditure, both private and public, when it comes to financing or funding education, so if you look at all of it, France spends about 5.2 points of its GDP, which is 0.2% less than the European Union, maybe slightly higher than Germany, but it's still 1,500 euros less per head of each student. So now what is it that comes to the top of our spending? It's 2.5 to 3% of our GDP that is being spent on retirement, as opposed to other advanced countries. Now, considering what the demographic trends are, it's not any better than elsewhere. So it's all a question of priorities and political options. Now, we'll talk about artificial intelligence this afternoon. Do you feel that artificial intelligence could help us to make up for this gap, to fill in this gap that you keep talking about? So perhaps we need to invest more in human intelligence first. Now, of course, AI can help you do a lot. It can automate research, etc. All the plus points and so on are known, and I think everybody present over here have heard all sorts of enthusiastic items on AI. Now, with economists, it's still open. This question is open, just as Philippe Avion, the French minister and a professor at Harvard, says that AI will be a vehicle of greater productivity gains, and it'll help us make a lot of growth. But those who are more skeptical, just like the latest economics Nobel Prize winner, he says that there's an impact which is very marginal, especially on low-paid jobs. So I don't know. I'm neither pro-AI nor anti-AI. Let me say that, put it this way. AI is certainly a disruptive innovation, but it has its limits, and one has to recognize that. Well, we are running a bit late, so let's try and conclude. So what are the limits of AI? And what are the limits to everything you're saying? Well, I'm not going to talk about DeepSeek, but the first obstacle I see for 2026 is the spread of AI in most companies, apart from all the major ones. AI is just covering less than 5% of most of the companies. There's a huge difference in the sectors. So it's 15%, for instance, in scientific sectors and 2 or 3% in the manufacturing sector. Apart from that, it's the market structure as well, which is rather monopolistic. Perhaps DeepSeek will change this order for the time being. It's just NVIDIA which is at the top of it all because it produces GPUs, and the results in France are fairly good for the time being. But I think in the long run, if it remains a monopoly, it will not spread. You need electricity, you need infrastructure to promote it. And I don't know, once again, if DeepSeek will change the order. Let's just wait for the dust to settle, and then we'll see. There's another limit as well, and that, I feel, is perhaps the worst, and that is the quality of information and of the data. And that is churned out by AI, which could be doubtful. There could be errors in resource allocation that it could cause, and that's very serious. What I'm saying is AI will maybe save or not save, but without going as far as what Altman said, the founder of ChatGPT, that AI will bring us to the end of humanity. That's, there's some people who are more pessimistic than I am. So you're comparing AI to a nuclear arm? Yes, and this was supposedly someone who was supposed to provide a solution. Well, all right, so I'm not that extremist, but AI will oblige us to take a keener look at sharing of values. We talked about it last year, and we'll be talking about it next year, this big gap that we have. But AI, because of its spread in the growth of capitalistic intensity in the economy, and so the sharing of wealth would be perhaps to the detriment of work and more in favor of capital. And I'll stop on that because I'll come back to it next year. One last question, please. According to you, do you feel there are any reasons for being optimistic concerning Europe and its future? So that, at least we leave on a smile. Well, I'm not a crystal gazer, I'm just an economist. But okay, right, you said be optimistic, so let's do it. Maybe after the break. Well, given the extent and scale of problems, and we talked about it with Xavier Durand, let's not forget that Europe was born of grief, of pain. It was obliged to do it. You mean we're in a crisis situation? Yes, of course we're in a crisis situation. And what's important is that we still have one advantage, one trump up our sleeve, and that is our savings, 400 billion euros. So for us now to mobilize it, to invest in innovation, education, future industry, and as Andrew Famke and Thomas said, maybe the context is now ready, despite the fact of all the issues, that we will now close ranks and perhaps we'll become attractive, not just for more opportunities, but also by the values that it has, which are its own values and which are more important than anything else. So thank you very much, Jean-Christophe Caffet, head economist at the Coface. Thank you so much.